Dr. Colin Hughes, head of the Graduate Business School. And I'd also like to welcome colleagues Dr. Olivia Freeman and Dr. Cormac McMahon, project leads on the SDG Literacy Group, which is funded by the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. A warm welcome to our TU Dublin students, faculty, and all other guests joining us tonight. I'd like to take a second to recognise the commitment of my colleagues here tonight to building a community in TU Dublin that can be a beacon for sustainability and help us to contribute to building a better world for business and for society. Now, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Alico McAlpine, our host for the evening and a lecturer with more than 20 years experience in supply chain management education. The focus of Alico's research is ensuring a living wage for garment workers in global supply chains. So Alico will be moderating this evening's panel, which we are so looking forward to. Enjoy the session, and over to you, Alico.
Thank you, Attain, and good evening, everybody. We have a fantastic panel of speakers this evening whom I'll introduce you to in a moment. This fashion sustainability event is so urgently required. Research on factory conditions at the end of the supply chain continuously show that garment workers work excessive hours for very low pay in unsafe conditions. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the vulnerability of workers making garments for large fashion and textile brands. Factory closures and cancelled orders left already impoverished workers unpaid for months on end. Meanwhile, the fashion industry is widely reported to be the second most polluting industry. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has calculated that the fashion industry contributes 10% of global carbon dioxide emissions every year, while it is estimated to use 1.5 trillion litres of water annually. And concerns are growing about pollution from chemical waste, microplastics, and disposed garments filling up our landfills. So this evening, we look at why these issues are occurring. We will look at the interconnectedness of social and environmental problems in garment supply chains, and we will unpack that affordability argument. We have an incredible panel who I'm so excited to introduce you to now. So I'll go around and I'll introduce each of you one by one. Okay, so I'll start with you, Nasreen. This is Nasreen Sheikh, and she is a survivor of modern day slavery and is now a powerful advocate for global human rights. Do you want to give everyone a wave? Okay. Hi, Kellie is next up. Kellie Dalton is a sustainability strategy expert and responsible fashion advisor and founder of the Right Project. And I have to mention that Kellie is one of our own. She's a graduate of the College of Business, TU Dublin. And lastly, Sophie Slater is a freelance facilitator, marketing and PR consultant, lecturer and writer, and co-founder of Birdsong, an award-winning social enterprise and cult fashion brand. So thank you, Nasreen, Kellie, and Sophie for joining us here this evening. Before we start, I just want to let you know that after the panel discussion, we'll have a Q&A managed by Dr. Lucia Walsh. So please put your questions in the chat and throughout the event, and Lucia will select some of the questions to put to the panel. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question to all the panelists. I'd like each of you in turn to tell me about your connection to the fashion industry. I thought we could start with you, Nasreen. So maybe you tell us your story.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being here and giving me your time and your attention to hear very heartbreaking story, but also very inspiring. And thank you so much, Alok, and all of you for being here. It is quite a miracle, an absolute miracle that I'm alive and connecting with all of you. My name is Nasreen Sheikh, and I escaped forced marriage, child labor in textile industry, and extreme poverty. I come from a dusty, undocumented village, which is not even found on any map or any books. a village where children are born onto the floor of their family homes, and neither birth or death records are kept. This is where I was born and began my journey as an undocumented person. In my village, every single young girls are being forced into marriage. And when my own 12-year-old sister was being forced into marriage, that is when I looked at my mother's face and she told me I would be next. And that was like, I was really going to be the next after my sister. But in my village, we had no role model, no one to look up to. So my life seemed destined with the same oppressive path. And that's where I feel like I had the first connection with fashion industry when I became a child labor between the age of 9 or 10. And I remember like how we were living in this 10 by 10 room, 6 people, we ate, we slept, we worked in that 10 by 10 room without a bathroom or a clean water. And I still remember those, like when we would have to work 12 to 15 hours a day, and to stay awake, we would have to splash cold water in our face to just be awake. And so many times when the pressure from the agent would come, I felt like my fingers were like, and my hands were moving as fast as machine. And still those pile of clothes would not finish. And if we did not meet our deadline, we would not get paid at all. So we had to finish that quota on time. And we were working 7 days a week for 10, 12, 15 hours a day, getting paid less than $2 a day. And my only bed was the large pile of clothes I toiled over every single day. And at night, we would all fall asleep on those clothes. And often I would wonder like where they were going to end up, who would wear them. And I started to really hate those clothes. And I felt like every single stitch was woven with the energy of my suffering. And that was the introduction to me with the fashion industry. It's quite devastating what happened to me. I felt like all of my childhood was stolen in that slavery.
Thank you, Nasreen. That's such a powerful story. And I can imagine how painful it is for you to have to retell it again and again. And I've been at lots of these fashion events over the years, and you know, sometimes we hear from people who have visited factories or have even snuck into factories to do research, but I've never had the opportunity to hear from someone like you. And I think we need to all appreciate how lucky we are to hear your story, to hear from you in person tonight. And thank you.
Thank you so much. I feel like the experience that I've been through, still some of my cousins and some of my because my village is undocumented, still so many people are still working in the sweatshop. And I, even though it's so hard to talk about trauma over and over and over, I do that with the hope of change, that one day these villages can be documented. One day the children does not need to work in the sweatshop. The women does not need to work 12 and 15 hours a day and not being paid, you know. So with that hope, you know, I'm being with all of you, and today just me feeling safe and can share this message just means a lot. So everybody who is here, I just have a deep respect for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasreen. Okay, Kellie, would you like to tell us about your connection to the fashion industry?
Sure, of course. I am unmuted, sorry. So I studied at DIT, as Alika mentioned earlier, in the School of Marketing. And as part of a piece of research that I was doing into the social and environmental impacts of the fashion industry, I had to do a case study on a company. So there wasn't really that many brands around at the time who were focusing on that specific side of the industry in terms of the economic, social, environmental impact right in the supply chains. But I, as you do in ethnographic research, threw out a load of letters, actual typed up letters showing when I did my degree. It was a long time ago. And one designer wrote back to me. And for me, I think it was very much a case of luck and timing, because the designer that wrote back to me, her name was Catherine Hamnett. And people don't really tend to know who she is now in the industry, like the younger generation who've come in. But she was one of the first designers to really start to focus in on these issues and calling it out in mainstream fashion media. So in 1989, she did a piece of research looking at exactly that, what was happening across the industry. And she says herself, horrified by what she found, decided to start trying to work more sustainable practices into her industry, getting to the bottom of her supply chain, finding out where her raw materials were coming from, looking at her manufacturing standards, and was met with a lot of resistance. Commercially, it wasn't viable at the time. There was no real options. The quality of fabric was poor. People weren't into paying higher price points. There wasn't a huge amount of understanding. But luckily for me, I landed on her doorstep to do my research. And I will say at the time, I was quite, I was interested in the topic, definitely. But also I was a bit like, oh, I'm going to work in fashion in London. This is so amazing. And when I got into her company, I was like, oh, fashion isn't actually what I thought it was. And it has this really, as you heard from Nasreen, which is just on the social side, this really devastating impact that actually I found the aesthetic quite ugly for a long period of time. The more I delved into what Catherine's company was doing in terms of research and what we were uncovering. We looked at the jewelry industry, we looked at gold and what was happening in the mining front. We looked at cotton, we looked at leather, lots of different textiles. And the more I got into it, the more passionate I became about trying to find solutions to it. And it was right place, right time, because Catherine was very much that person at the time. And it kind of just went from there, really. My experience bounced from Catherine's then to bigger companies like Burberry. And then that kind of experience also being inside a massive commercial company, you just get to see how long and the reasons why it takes a long time to make changes within companies. So yeah, that's my main connection. I should also give a shout out to my mother, who is really actually my main connection to the industry, because she was a home worker and I never really thought about that at the time, but she knit and crocheted and she basically a dressmaker, but she did it from her house for brands in Ireland. And it was only until I got into the industry and I learned about migrant workers and home workers and subcontracting that I was like, oh, that's actually what my mum was doing at home at the time. But because we were in a Western country, we never had that kind of idea that that's what was happening in the same way we think about home workers being a risk factor in different countries anyway. So I made that association. So shout out to my mother who did that at home when we were kids and young teenagers, because that's really where I think my sort of interest in the industry started, but possibly also her values and how she worked kind of led me into the track of looking at things from a social and environmental perspective. So.
Fantastic, Kellie, thank you. You've got a wealth of experience in the industry, and I will come back to you later about how to bring about change in organizations. Okay, Sophie, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your connection to the fashion industry?
Thanks so much. And so great to hear from Kellie and Nasreen as well. Thank you so much for sharing. So my kind of first interaction with the fashion industry started when I was 15, and I was scouted to work for a big modelling agency in London, coming from like a small town in the northeast. It was very exciting, very glamorous. But there was quite a lot, this is kind of like 15 years ago now. It was very homogenous, the kind of like type of body and race that kind of girls who were scouted had. And there was quite a lot of body policing, quite a lot of obviously fat phobia. I think the modelling industry's come on kind of leaps and bounds, but back in, 2006, it was not particularly progressive. So on the one hand, I kind of was exposed to a lot of magazines like ID and Dazed and kind of more gender neutral titles, and I've been used to reading up home in Newcastle. And that made me fall in love with the imagery and the photography. But I kind of remained quite critical of the fashion industry from a kind of objectifying of women perspective, I guess. And I was eventually told that although my feet were really big, I wasn't quite tall enough, and my bum was too big, so they'd be letting me go at the tender age of 17. And then I ended up working in fashion retail for a long time. I worked for a vintage company in Newcastle and got really into kind of vintage clothing and secondhand. And then I worked for a quite well-known brand called American Apparel in their retail stores. And that was kind of like a double-edged sword. Like, on the one hand, they were really fantastic about educating the staff and the customers about sweatshops, about what it meant to kind of pay workers fairly, what a kind of ethical brand meant in terms of workers' rights, and kind of, you know, they'd produce things in organic cotton sometimes, so learning about that. But on the other hand, again, massive objectification of women, sexualization in their adverts that were kind of cancelled by the Advertising Standards Authority. But as a kind of like really bored retail assistant for 5 years, I dug behind the reports, and when I was sat behind the till with nothing to do, I would kind of like read into as much as I could about them. And then got really involved with kind of activism and feminism at my university, and took a departure from the fashion industry and ended up working in the women's sector and violence against women and girls sector. And it wasn't until I kind of moved to London and did an alternative postgrad in social innovation with a company called Yehe that the two kind of converged. So I was working in a homeless shelter, which is pretty far removed from the fashion industry, and working on a women's wellbeing program. And my mum always, when I was growing up, worked with adults with learning disabilities and people facing barriers to work, doing like arts and crafts workshops. So we were doing kind of arts and crafts, and I contacted loads of women's organisations who did crafts and potentially had like a social enterprise arm to their business to bring in extra revenue through crafting. And they were all completely flat out, couldn't do any outreach. Did some more kind of research and reporting, found that 92% of women's organisations at that time, about 8 years ago, had a funding crisis or funding cuts. So we had the opportunity to kind of create like a project, and as a trial run, we started working with a group of older women from an Age UK day centre, and they'd been kind of knitting things and then donating them to charity to kind of have something to do with their hands and a sense of purpose. So we offered to sell their goods in order to give the money back to the centre. And that's how we started 7 years ago with Birdsong, which is a social enterprise fashion brand that pays above living wages to women in London facing barriers to work mostly. And yeah, those two kind of convergences of the fashion industry and kind of women and girls sector joined.
Fantastic, Sophie. It's such an interesting story and so inspiring. And I will definitely ask you some questions later about the business model and pricing and around that affordability argument that we hear about a lot. Okay, so I think it would be useful for the audience to kind of get a real understanding of the structure of the fashion industry and, you know, how it's structured, the pricing, kind of an overview. And maybe Kellie, you'd like to start off on that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, this is something I kind of struggle with a lot when you're trying to communicate to people about sustainable fashion, because lots of times people sort of hone in on one thing or another, like sustainable materials, or this brand says it's circular, or, you know, whatever kind of aspect of sustainability brands are working on. But it really helps to be able to step back and look at the industry for what it is. So for the most part, brands are on a sell cheap, sell in big volumes. And that's what mainstream big fashion brands do. If they're luxury brands, they're great on one end of the spectrum, or if they're what we call fast fashion brands, or now we have ultra fast fashion brands. And with the influx of Shein, we now have ultra fast fashion brands, but that's maybe for later on in the conversation. So you have those brands that are selling smaller margins, bigger volumes, cheaper price. And that's kind of aimed at mass market, everyday people. And it's what we see kind of dominates the narrative around social and environmental challenges within the industry. That's not to let the kind of more luxury end off the hook either, because there's as many significant challenges there, maybe not so much on pricing, but that's for later on in the conversation. So you just have this huge array of companies then in between who are more mid-size, mid-sector brands who are reliant on what's called a wholesale model. Not all of them, but you'll have this wholesale model where you brands sell forward to retailers. Retailers pay a wholesale price, which is maybe above cost price, to cover some of the costs and make a little bit of profit for the brands. But the margins are really small for those kind of mid-size independent brands. And Sophie, maybe you could talk a bit about that later. I don't know if Birdsong do any wholesaling. But what happens is it leaves that mid-section of brands really tight on budgets, tight on resources. So where we have this kind of broad expectation that all brands should be focusing and working on sustainability, and they absolutely should, you have this mid-section of brands now who actually don't have the resources to do that, and they're operating in this old school mainstream way of not necessarily looking at their social and environmental impact. So it's just that kind of having that greater understanding of we are in a capitalist economy, and within that we are in a fashion industry, and within that we are in a sustainability bubble within that fashion industry, and then there's us, but we're all wholly reliant on the living world, and that surpasses everything. It surpasses the economy, but as we know, we are using way more resources, like 3 planets every single year, more than we are actually able to. And that's the biggest issue with the industry. And it will cut across the affordability argument when we get to later, because you can sit and sort of cut things any which way you want. Like, we should be able to afford product, and yes, we know people get paid low wages in those countries, but that's just the economic model, and all businesses need to be able to grow, where in actuality we cannot continue to grow the way that we are. So I mean, without jumping too far ahead, what my role actually weirdly involves now, and I mean, I'll talk about the detail of what I do as well, is looking at economics and how we can look at green growth and deep growth and degrowth, and how we figure out those massive macro issues. So where people I know are really interested in, oh, you know, how can we change our materials to be more sustainable, or how can we change our supply base, or how can we put modern slavery policies in place? What we're actually looking at is a fundamental shift in a whole entire global, well, Western economic model, and how a dominant one, and how can we do that? So I don't know if that has confused things a bit more at the beginning, but I do think it's super important to have that big macro view before you get into the nitty gritty of how you run a brand in an alternative way, really, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about an alternative to the traditional mainstream way the industry has been run to date. Okay,
thanks, Kellie. That was really informative. Do you have anything to add to that, Sophie or Nasreen?
Yeah, I would like to add on that. When these companies goes to manufacturing these goods in these lower GDP countries, such as Nepal, India, Bangladesh, what happened is they set up these, big factory that looks, perfectly outside, and then behind these big factories have small factories. A small factory has the teeny factories, and tiny factories has a small tiny room hidden in unmarked buildings. That's where they use all these undocumented people who are like just, treated worse than machine, literally, and have no human rights values in there. The dignity is not there. People don't feel each other. Just recently, I had one of our women coming to our center and sharing the story that how some companies in Dubai is making her work, 10, 12 hours a day, and her feet got swollen, and she's sleeping in a small room with 6 other girls, and they're being very low wage paid. And so it's just this cycle of underserved communities of people who are being used as a machine and not having any values, and literally these companies are making money out of people like us. Can be only this issues can be solved when the Western world can really understand that slavery that we used to happen in the histories is still here, but it changed the form, you know, and now the form of that is in the products, you know, the clothes, the chocolate, the jewelry, you know, the slavery contains in that. And our communities in Nepal and India and Bangladesh, we are so unsustainable. Like our rivers are dead. We don't have rivers now, you know, and our forests are like all human habitat is taking over because every single young girls are being forced into marriage, and they are being told by the religious belief system and all that to have 5, 6, 7, 8 babies. And they, in the end of the day, when they become 15, 16, they all go to the workforce, and they becoming a vacuum of this economy. And I feel like how far we can go, like, you know, when children and when the woman is exposed to such situation as like forced labor or slavery or poverty, they lose the essence of love within their heart. And when they lose that, it becomes a perpetuate cycle of very extreme poverty. And COVID was like a perfect example to show that how connected we are, that even one person is unsafe, we all are unsafe. And so I just feel like the whole model around economy, that the way that it is built, it's built on the people of underserved communities, and people in the Western world really needs to realize that how can we give like how can we create economy that honors humanity and nature, and these people in the underserved communities can have fair salaries, can have living wages, so they can send their children to the schools, so they can also dream, you know. Like I was in the COVID, I spent 8 months in the undocumented village in underserved communities, and in this 8 months, I interviewed 400 women. And in those 400 women, 98% of did not even know how to sign their name. So if they don't know how to even sign their names, how they're going to ask, like we don't know what sweatshop means, because the whole society is sweatshop, you know? So I feel like our communities are really desperately looking for economic change on the Western world, so that can have a positive impact in our part of the world. And the model around fashion industry, how I see is there is a retail, there is a wholesale, and there is a manufacturing, you know, there is a bulk, you know, and it's so broken into pieces that it's so hard for organizations to put that together. That's why every major supply chain contains slavery. It does not mean that whole products contain slavery. It means like maybe the person who picks the cotton, you know, when I was in the sweatshop, I was just stitching one thing over and over and over, and they made us do that way so we can be very expert on that, and we can be work as like just machine fast as we can. And also we will be not able to make the whole piece, because if we make the whole piece, we are artists. So they didn't wanted us to be an artist. They wanted to be just a workforce of one place over and over and over. So and that made me feel like a machine, you know. So my creative ideas, my brain started to shut down, and I'm just a living machine. So that whole everything that we are talking about, it goes in the end of the day on the economic structure, and it is really built on the back of poor people, undocumented, underserved, and especially women. I feel like women have been through so much all over the world, you know, in a many different level, and I feel like we are the one that is going to change this. Now speak up our voice.
Yeah, I think so too. And we have an all-female panel this evening. So back to that affordability issue, we might as well get stuck into it now. Brands will say, you know, consumers want cheap fashion, and they will say that that's why there is this race to the bottom and that they have to keep wages low. And that's the argument we hear again and again and again, the affordability. Would anyone like to speak to that? Maybe Sophie?
Yeah, I'd love to speak to that. I just want to say as well, I love the kind of macro analysis of trying to survive under capitalism, and the kind of overview of the fashion industry obviously is so tied up in colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, violence against women, and exploitation of the working class. And I think that point you were saying, Nasreen, about, you know, just stitching one thing at a time. I think when our makers get to make an entire garment, that's really important to us, to kind of own that means of production and feel ownership over that product and feel pride. And we know that's where the social impact comes from as well, from feeling ownership. And the women we work with will often make the same pattern for themselves. They can have access to the fabrics. So it's really important. I think we wouldn't expect someone in a fashion marketing job to be working for poverty pay, like 14 hours a day. So why are the artisans at the kind of product level being forced to work like that? And I think the affordability question, it's really interesting you were saying about the ultra fast fashion, because I think even 20 years ago, clothing was more expensive, and we never saw kind of like £5 dresses, for example. And we know that, you know, sweatshops in the UK have been operating on a kind of £3.50 hour kind of wage since at least 2015 and before, and that the government have known about it because it was in the Fix and Fashion report in 2018, 2019. It was kind of brought into relief more with the kind of COVID outbreak in Leicester, because brands were sending garment workers to non-essential jobs to manufacture for them in kind of really close conditions with no safety involved. But yeah, the affordability argument comes up a lot. I think it's this alienation of knowing the work and art that goes into creating a garment. I think we're so far removed. You know, we can order something and it just appears on our doorstep in a bag, could have come from outer space. We're not taught how to sew in schools anymore. It's not on the curriculum. So we have no idea the kind of level of craft and skill that goes into making that garment. And yeah, it's something we get criticized with a lot, actually, our price point. And also just this kind of like deliberate opaqueness to the fashion industry. I think, like, you know, it kind of exists and thrives on this level of exclusivity and what's unsaid rather than what's said. And I think that adds to the kind of mystery of not knowing where the money goes behind, you know, a product. We do direct to consumer only, so we can keep our margins down as much as possible and keep our goods as affordable as possible, but they're not made in a factory. They're made in like a community arts centre workshop. They're made with the best sustainable fabrics we can get. They're made to order, so we pay a 20% premium on top of the like £15 an hour that we pay for that. So it's a real sticking point, and I think we've had to try really hard to communicate exactly what goes into a product and where that money goes, and justify it constantly, actually, because we're not operating at the scale of you know, even like most independents, like we are operating on a really small scale.
Alika, if I can just add to that. I'll just add to that. I definitely think the affordability thing, you're back into the needs versus wants, right? So you hear people saying about, oh, affordability, and there's people who can't afford to shop anywhere else. Okay, fine, let's park those people to the side, because 100% those people should have access to clothing. It's a human right, should be, because really what we're not talking about is fashion. We're talking about clothing, footwear, textiles. It could be your tea towel in your kitchen, it could be your curtains, your bed sheets, your socks, your school uniform you put on every day, or your fancy dress for a Saturday night out. So, I mean, obviously I work with high-end brands, but it's all the same across the industry. So I think we are talking about needs versus wants, really, and they're very, very different things. I mean, the global consumption of apparel, I think it's set to rise to 102 million tons by 2030, which is the equivalent of 500 billion t-shirts new on the planet every single year, with no large-scale circular closed loop solution to deal with that waste. That does not exist. When we hear about circularity at the moment, that does not exist. There's small scale pilots that are going on with big companies, and that's all great. Maybe by 2030 we'll get there, but that's not the case. So I think the affordability thing, people really need to just take a look at what we're buying, how much we're pushing, and just the newness and the trends. And if you continually go into shops and need to consume, what is that saying about us as a society? Because for the most part, let's just say mainstream fashion industry is propped up by middle class consumers with disposable income. Nothing wrong with that, but are we truly buying what we need, or are we buying what we want? And we constantly want what we want. And here we are in the situation we are about consumption, and then the overconsumption of resources. So, I mean, Sophie has been quite modest in that they do excellent breakdowns of pricing for their brand in comparison to more mainstream companies. So I recommend anyone to head over to the Birdsong Instagram and check out their infographics about the breakdown, because to be honest, even for myself, it's quite eye-opening to see the difference between the two and actually what you get in terms of cost per wear, because that's something I don't think maybe independent brands make enough use of, is the breakdown of cost per wear. And if you do invest in pieces, which I know not everybody is in a position to be able to do, but if you do invest in pieces, actually the value for money over time. But again, it's back to this point of just trying to, I guess, deprogram ourselves, because the industry has subsidized us and our ability to consume fashion a lot against the quality of life of people who work in supply chains and the environment. So I do think it's a much bigger consumer culture issue, which is not just particular to fashion, but I guess what makes fashion unique is it's so tied to our personal identity, whether we want to stand out in the crowd or whether we don't want to be noticed or just play sports every day. It's all tied to our personal identity. And I think that's what makes consumption of fashion quite an emotional thing for people, because you want to be able to feel good and look good and fit in and have the best product and whatever it is. That's what makes it slightly different to other industries. But I do think it's important to look to consumer culture generally when we're thinking about the pricing and the affordability argument.
Okay, thanks, Kellie. Nasreen, did you want to say something there?
Yeah, I feel like if consumer will know the truth about how much it takes and to make one garment, and if the consumer will know that there are a sweatshop that women are working 12-15 hours a day and their children are hungry, they're not able to go to the schools, they can't afford that. So I feel like a lot of those stories are removed from the narrative, and that makes consumer feel like, okay, everything is made by somewhere automatically, just like, oh, it's just $10, like, okay, we can afford it, we can afford maybe 10, maybe 15, maybe we don't need to do the laundry, let's just trash it, or let's just donate it, and then in the end of the day that goes back to our countries and it goes to the landfill. So I feel like the vicious cycle of removing the people who have been in those supply chains, and they will share the story of designers, they will share the story of the founder of those companies, but they never share the story of the people, that how much it takes to grow the cotton, how much when I was in the sweatshop, my hand was so much filled with kerosene oil, and then I would have to and then in the end of the day it would be so black, turn out so black, and then I would have to put, we didn't had any Dettol soap or anything, or not even enough clean water to wash my hand, so we would use kerosene oil to take that dust away. And then whenever I would eat my food, we would have long threads and all the dust, because it was 10 by 10 room, and we ate, we slept, we worked in that room. And if people could know that story, and if they knew that I was 9 or 10 years old and I'm being forced to work 12-15 hours a day, and I'm eating the food that is had bugs in it and has pollution in it, and I'm picking up the thread and my hands are dirty and I don't even have a clean water to clean my hand, people would feel the empathy, because I know as a human being, we all drive for positive change. We are looking for that change. So it is the matter of inclusion, how much we can include, how much power we can bring in telling those stories, these workers who are I speak 5 different languages, and because of the language in these villages, women are already so suppressed that they can't even sign their names. So we need to reinvest in these communities to make these people to at least share their stories of who they are. And what I see in the ground is these communities, they carry hundreds of years of knowledge and cultures and traditions, and those things are dying because of this fast consumerism world, and we all feel unbalanced, out of balance, and consumer world, like the Western world, can feel that the climate change and human rights and social rights, those issues, and we are having a really hard time where to take action, and where to take action is, I feel like, including everybody in and coming up with and giving those people voices, giving the chances to speak up, that how does it feel to work every single day, sitting from 4 a.m. to until 11 p.m. in the same machine, where when you go to the bathroom, your time is being counted, or if you are in the bathroom, somebody's knocking you and telling you like, hey, it's 5 minutes over, you need to come back and sit in the machine. They call you in the midnight and tell you like, your pile of clothes, the 500 pieces, if it's not finished by Sunday evening, you will be not being paid for this whole entire week because your order is canceled and we will not pay you. Those stories needs to be told to the consumer in the most truth and authentic way, to let them know what is happening, because our stories and the stories of over 40 million people who are still in modern day slaveries, those stories are hidden, and it is those people will have nowhere to come out and speak, because as a survivor, only I know that how much iron gate, how much gate I had to break through my own culture. Like my own culture, my own village became my own enemy when I was breaking that cycle up. And it took so much courage and so much sacrifice to come and share these stories that only I know, and I still feel unsafe. And if the companies and the people can demand, the consumer can become aware that there are over 29 million women and girls right now are still repeating the same cycle that I survived. And if they can speak up for them and say like, who makes my clothes, where these things come from, I would like to know the supply chain. These companies will go back to these factories, they will go back and they will understand that there's a faces of children that is making these clothes. There's faces of these very unhealthy, malnourished women that is just working. And when those stories will be uncovered, I feel like consumer is just going to never, I don't want to like put on consumer, because I feel like they're just not being told the truth, and I see whoever, like I talk to many college, universities and students, and when they hear my story, they all go back to like, how can I shop ethically? I just want to buy one clothes and I want to know where my things come from. It becomes a mission for them. So I just feel like inclusion of every department, from picking the cotton to all the way to designing it, selling it, putting into the store, all these stories needs to be told and give justice to everybody,
Thanks, Nasreen. Yes, everybody along the supply chain needs to be held accountable. But I suppose we have lots of students here tonight that are going to go off working in organizations, good global citizens who want to bring about positive change. And I suppose, Kellie, you've got a lot of experience in the fashion industry and working in various organizations. And I was wondering, what advice would you give to someone who starts working for any organization who wants to kind of bring about some positive change?
Probably, it's funny, advice that was probably given to me when I started off as well. Someone said to me, you need 5 key things. I think I'm only going to be able to remember 4, but anyway, I'll try. One of them was to have good business knowledge, good deep knowledge of sustainability issues that were going on. Be very observant. So when you go into companies first, I mean, these are, career advice for any job, I guess, that you go into. Be very observant and look at how teams work, how teams are influenced in terms of taking things on, how people like to receive information, and just generally observe conversations and things that are happening around you and how people speak to NGOs and their suppliers and all that kind of thing. But the one I think that has stuck with me the longest is resilience. So I think in sustainability, when you start to get into how deep and broad it is and how big the problems are, but also how exciting the solutions can be, it's being able to stay the course, really, because there are definitely times, and I mean, maybe Sophie and Nasreen, you can talk to this as well, but where you just want to go, this is too much now. What change can I have as one person? What change can I affect? And I can pass knowledge on to people. But I think Attain maybe at the beginning said something that made my ears prick up, because what we're seeing is a huge rise in education and awareness, right, which is great, but it's the action part that we're still stalling on, because I feel like, yes, we talk about sustainability a lot more, and it's definitely come out of the sustainable fashion, London, Paris, New York bubbles into the mainstream a bit more, but we're not in the mainstream by any stretch of the imagination. So trying to kind of move past this education and awareness bit into action is super important. So as much as you can tool yourself up with all of that information, I do think when you start to learn more and when you get pushback maybe from your business sometimes about different things that you can and can't do, or on the other hand, when something works and it's amazing and you can measure impact on the ground and you get to meet suppliers and all that really exciting stuff, it can be an emotional roller coaster, definitely, because essentially I think as a sustainability person, which I also don't think there should just be a sustainability team. I think every single person that Sophie and Nasreen mentioned right across the whole entire industry should be involved in the sustainability of the company and the industry. You start to just be able to try and think about how you can really have that impact as one person within an organization. So I've lost my train of thought there when I was talking about impact, but what you can do as a person within as a person going into a company. Yeah, it's the pushback sometimes commercially can be really tough to try and constantly convince people, but when you eventually do and things start to flow in the industry, being able to see that impact is a really, really great thing. So I do think it's that having deep, broad knowledge as much as you can, learning quickly on the job, and also just being able to just manage those bumpy rides and the reports that come out every week. Because now I definitely remember my point. You are the mid person between all of those teams. You're the person responsible for delivering the information, introducing people to supply chains, but also the more you get into sustainability, the more you start to care about the impact that you're having as well. And that's the tough bit when you do see that pushback about the commercial argument, but also in some cases is maybe the right thing for that business at that time, because essentially you're talking about the survival of the business in some ways. So yeah, I think it's resilience is my one key takeaway from working in the industry, and to try and build that up into yourself.
Okay. Thanks, Kelly. That's very, very helpful. I can see this has gone by so quickly. I can see we're running out of time. I did want to touch though on the environmental impact of the fashion industry. We've spoken a lot or heard a lot this evening about like the social and the human impact, but I just don't think people realize how interconnected the environmental problems and the damage that the fashion industry is doing to the environment. Sophie, coming in there. Okay.
Yeah, 100%. I think as well, like the fact that we are creating collectively, well, not us, fast fashion brands and fashion in general, we're creating, 100 billion garments a year? That scale can't happen when people are paid decent wages or work in decent conditions, because as Nasreen was saying, that's like kind of pushing humanity to uncomfortable levels, working too hard for too little pay. And if everyone kind of took a step back, allowed their workers breaks, paid them a livable kind of living wage, we wouldn't be producing at that volume, unless kind of more people wanted to get involved with the garment trade. But even so, it wouldn't be profitable for the brands that make it that volume. So I think that's why they're super interconnected. But yeah, and I think it's really tricky as well to go back to the points that you're both saying. I think consumers do want to kind of connect, and they do have the empathy. But then when you see massive brands kind of greenwashing, I walked past one of the biggest high street bargain retailers on Peckham High Street the other day, and they're kind of marketing. They've got massive sign in their window saying, "We care, we're empowering women. All of our fabrics are going to be circular by 2027." And it's really hard as a consumer to even know. And I think even people working in sustainability teams, in marketing departments or in sustainability teams that are so removed from garment workers and so removed from the kind of bottom of the supply chain and removed from the climate change impacts as well. So I think it's just really important to kind of keep updated and keep reading those IPC. Is it IPPC? I always get the anagram wrong. That's the one. Reports, as depressing as it is, because it is fundamental to realise and communicate as a brand how the two are interlinked, I guess, without resorting to greenwashing. Yeah,
and to your point on, greenwashing and sustainability and the brands and the environmental issues, even cotton, a lot of brands will say this is our sustainable cotton range, but I don't think people realize what an issue cotton is and what it does to our water resources. Nasreen, you said that there is your environment has been destroyed. Do you want to expand on that a little?
Yeah, I feel like when we talk about environment and human rights, everything is just so connected, and whatever we do, it has a ripple effect in our lives, in our family lives, in our community lives, in our eventually the world. That's how, like, when people in Western world, when they consume more, it affects the underserved community. That's the law of nature, that whatever you do, anything you do, you're not just doing and affecting your life, you're affecting everything. And so first of all, we have to be very, very conscious, and we need to become aware that how powerful our action is, because with your action you could be putting someone in slavery, and with your action you could be freeing someone. So it's really about choosing, becoming a conscious. And right now you have access to mobile and you have access to internet. Just Google it, and search, like, what's the effect of fast fashion on the environment, and you will know, like, how it's affecting environment. It's taking everything. In our villages, the children don't know anymore what it is, what the birds looks like, because all the humans have taken over. The children in the city of Nepal, Kathmandu, don't know what river looks like. How sad it is, that children, our future children, will not know what the future looks like.
What happened to the river?
The river it was discarded with all the pollutions and dyes from these factories were discarded to the rivers, and then people were throwing all these things, and the river became a trash container, literally. Like, instead of we have the plastic containers, the river became our trash container, and it's dead now. And when people walk by, it smells so bad. Just imagine when you haven't empty your trash bin for, like, years, how that would smell. It's that type of smell that river has, and the city children don't know. So I feel like COVID had reminded us, all of us collectively, that how connected we are. And I think that we need to think big, and we need to open our heart and mind. And we not only need to protect the environment, but we need to protect our clean water. We need to protect nutritious food. We need to build safe shelter. We need quality education. We need healthcare. We need access to technology. These are the, like, I feel like 7 keys for global human rights that I call. It's such an essential need. Like, if we leave one and work on another, we're still, like, having a hard time. So we need to include these 7 keys in our aspect of our leadership. When we do the businesses, we need to think about environment, we need to think about water, we need to think about our food, how it's going to impact. So those are the ethics I feel like will really help the businesses to do the business that you can make money, and you can be happy. We can have a good economy where it does not contain slavery, or it does not affect the environment. So the coming generation, already our generation is already feeling that. We already know that. And we just have a lot of homework to do. And the people who are joining this movement and trying to educate themselves, I would just request them that please just use your internet, because 4 billion people right now in our planet don't have access to internet. And you do, and you have the knowledge, and knowledge is power. Those people in the underserved communities don't have education, and we are looking up to you, and we're looking for your support. So yeah.
Thanks, Nasreen. Thank you. And with regards to the change you would like to see, is there anything you'd like to see governments do to kind of change the situation environmentally, social? Kellie, Sophie?
So much. I think at the minute there's no incentive for brands to pay a living wage. The government in the UK at least positively rewards companies that value profit above all else. We pay the same amount of VAT as consumers on products that are much more expensive because we're paying a living wage and using the best sustainable fabrics. There's a flat rate of 20% VAT on our products and on Shane's, I can't say what the brand's called. So that's kind of punishing consumers for wanting to do better. There's no tax relief on repair services to kind of keep more clothes in circulation. There's no tax relief for paying a living wage. There's basically no incentive to do better as a business from the way that we do things currently. And that's why I think the UK is the kind of capital of fast fashion, because it's been so well rewarded with people like Philip Green getting knighthoods.
Okay. Kellie, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, sorry, I missed a little bit of it. I had a visitor from some children, but what I will say is that we're starting to see stronger regulation come through from a European perspective, which is really good. I mean, the ideal, brands have been left to self-regulate for so long, and you hear about all of these things, and the ideal is that you would want brands to step up, but obviously everybody's not. So legislation is having to be put into place. It's much stronger now. A couple of examples of that are in Germany. I think it was 2 or 3 months ago. New human rights diligence legislation came into place where companies that are headquartered in Germany would be liable for what's happening in their supply chain, even if they don't own their factories, which that is the first time, maybe, I mean, in California, something like that kind of roughly exists, but it's the first time a European country has done that. And like, that will put brands under serious pressure, but you've been left to self-regulate for so long, it's only going to speed the process up, hopefully. And France have really good legislation around the waste side of things now, and are sort of leading the way in terms of the UK looking to them for how that they're going to manage their sort of extended producer responsibility legislation. In the UK, whether this actually pans out or not, there will be, or there is, maybe actually Sophie, you could comment on this, but legislation in place for communication around sustainability claims. So it's the I think environmental green guide it's called, but it's basically to stop brands from greenwashing. And brands now have until January 2022 to comply with that. So it's kind of coming at it from a few different angles now. And yes, you could argue that the countries, maybe not so much the UK, but other European ones that are bringing in laws, like in Sweden, there's a chemicals tax on products with certain concentrations of hazardous substances and things like that are happening. You could argue that those countries are more progressive, but we're starting to just see it more and more. So that's the thing, even though weirdly I'm like, oh, can brands just not do it? Regulation is not that exciting. For me, that gives me a little bit of hope that actually we're starting to see the stick with brands a little bit more, because even my job as a sustainability professional, you go into brands, and to be honest, most teams that you meet within brands are quite enthusiastic and passionate about getting these things done, but at a certain point we get back to profit over everything else, and it just stops right there, and you get these teams of people who are super passionate and they're driving things, but it stops at a certain point, and then it's like, okay, how do we regulate how we make that profit? And again, I'm back into you get into that economic theory around degrowth, green growth, and how all that's going to work. So, but the last 2 years we've definitely seen a surge in either consultate or legislative proposals that are being consulted on, or actual regulation that's been put in place. And sorry, just another quick one to mention, because we were talking specifically about living wage earlier. The Circle is a charity based in the UK, and they have different circles of professionals who try to improve conditions within supply chains for women and girls. They have a proposal in an EU level for what a compulsory living wage regulation would look like. And what they're proposing essentially is that brands importing goods into the UK will be punished essentially for doing that if it's coming from countries that don't pay a living wage, because a lot of the time the price on wages is driven down by purchasing practices from brands. So they're flipping it and saying, okay, that's fine, but if you bring stuff into the country, a country that's not paying a living wage, that's on you to sort out. So it's trying to influence the relationship back the other way. Anyway, we could actually have a whole separate conversation on regulation, because there's tons of things that are starting to happen. So it's the less exciting part maybe of sustainability for some people, but it's a thing that does give me hope, that things might change in the next 5 to 10 years.
You've just given me a lot of hope, Kellie. Thank you.
Oh, good. I'm glad my boring legislation chat.
No, I love it. I did actually take part in the greenwashing kind of environmental claims committee and give evidence.
Brilliant.
Which was really great actually. But there were a lot of bigger brands in there who were quite scared.
Yeah, I imagine so. I was looking at it coming out today, and even, we deal with material suppliers sometimes, and how those material suppliers talk about their materials. There was one today, again, I won't mention names, but we're talking about the health benefits of their fabric, and you look it up and it's actually completely not attached to their material. It was something, in a raw material, and you're just like, how are these companies going to be able to unpick what they've put out into the world already? Because a lot of it is on this super slick, I'm not even going to say marketing spin, but they just have been able to communicate with any verifiable hard data in the background and use terms that are confusing to customers that make people think things are good, when actually they might be okay. Are they that great? We don't really know, because there's no data behind. And that's what hopefully this piece of legislation that Sophie consulted on is going to just weed out, I hope, in the next 2 to 3 years. And maybe it might come in at EU level as well, fingers crossed.
Great, because it is so confusing for consumers who are trying to do the right thing.
Definitely.
100%. And brands are profiting off how nebulous a word sustainability is, because it's not really got a definition at the moment. So
yeah. Thanks, Sophie and Kellie. We seem to have lost Nasreen. I think she was having a few Wi-Fi problems earlier, so hopefully she'll come back. But I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Lucia Walsh, who will start the Q&A session. So if you want to join. Hi, Lucia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your talk. I have been trying to take notes and go through all the questions that we've been getting, which has been difficult, but fascinating. I have learned a lot myself now here as well. So we have lots of questions. Some of them are similar, so we have picked a number of them. We'll see how much time we have time you have to go through of them. So I would like to first invite Trevor to ask his question, please. So Trevor, if you're there, you can put your mic on and your camera, and please go ahead and ask a question.
Lucia, do you want to read out Trevor's question?
I will. Okay, so Trevor asked about the government actions. You talk about legislation a little bit, but how important do you think that the government legislation is in ensuring real change in the fashion industry is achieved?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk to this first if you like. I mean, you obviously got how passionate I am about the fact that it will come into place. If my honest answer is, I don't know, it does definitely give me hope. But you see things like in the UK, there's the Modern Slavery Act, right? So the Modern Slavery Act is where brands over 34 million, I think, euro or pounds profit every year have to report on steps they're taking to ensure that no modern slavery occurs in their supply chain, even if they don't own their factories. Were lots of brands really scared? Yes, they were. Did lots of brands put reports together and statements year on year? Yes, they did. Does anybody audit those reports? No, they don't. So the next stage then is, right, how do we put more pressure on to get the government to put some funding in place to start auditing those reports? The fact that it happened in the first place, okay, great. But it's just, I think it's with everything in sustainability, it's this journey to make things consistently better, and you can never sit back and take it for granted, because the way our economic model is, it will always be profit first. So I mean, similarly here in the UK as well, there's a a piece of legislation that's being consulted on to ensure there's no deforestation in fashion supply chains. And they're talking about a similar model, over £34 million turnover. You have to put a statement out to say that there's no deforestation in your supply chain, right down to the bottom, which can be any, obviously, wood-based goods, but it's any leather brands as well. So it's not just fashion, you're looking at cars, automobiles, all that kind of stuff. The one that has given me the most hope, though, I will say, is that due diligence one in Germany, because that has really put it up to brands now, because it's kind of said enough is enough. We don't want you messing around anymore. This isn't just a little halfway, give us a report. It's like someone in your supply chain can take a case against you. Now, you could argue that someone in a supply chain mightn't be in a situation to be able to take a case against a brand, but there's plenty of NGOs that would line up to support that garment worker now, because they've been working in the background for a long time. So I'm in the middle about it, really, but it does, for the most part, give me a little bit of hope. Sophie, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, 100%. I think it would level the playing field a little bit, because at the minute we're kind of being undercut on price, on marketing spend, on kind of everything. And I think, yeah, a kind of a cut to greenwashing or some sort of accountability for bigger brands and fast fashion brands would help to level the playing field when there's companies, I guess, like mine, who are genuinely trying to do things as fairly as possible. But yeah, that's what I'd add to that. And yeah, laws like the California one that just passed, where that's similar to the German one, I think definitely, you know, we see garment workers celebrating those laws as like quite historic. And I think that definitely gives me hope that, you know, that is an important piece of legislation, 100%.
Thanks, Sophie and Kellie.
Thank you very much. I would invite Raina to ask her question, please, if you were still here with us.
Yes, hi everyone. I'll just use my mic. My question to Lucia here was, I would love for any of you to talk a little bit more specifically about sustainably oriented certification. Personally, I teach fashion marketing at the college level in Montreal, Canada, and I find it to be difficult to understand a bit the hierarchy of certification as it stands, without there being an agreed upon global gold standard of approach and best practices. So any commentary to this respect would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really hard. I feel like we get approached maybe half a dozen times a week with a new certification that's on offer, or yeah, kind of like a new kind of test to take, or new documentation, or new ethical platform that will kind of tell our story and show how ethical we are. And I think that is the problem. There is kind of no gold standard. I think for me, I quite like the B Corp certification. We're in the middle of applying for that because it's more of a holistic view. And in the UK, we've got living wage accreditation as well, though that's not as rigorous as I think it should be, to be quite honest. But yeah, I don't know what you think, Kellie.
Probably same point, there's just way too many. It's really difficult to be able to, well, understand. And Raina, I don't know if did you say you're materials specialist, or just certifications across the board you educate on?
Yeah, just I guess across the board.
Yeah.
Generally.
There is no one methodology, as you've already said. You know, it's really tricky. And even, for example, like Sophie mentioned B Corp there, yes, brilliant. It's very much a holistic perspective, but it's for all industries. And then there's so many nuances within the fashion industry. Then you kind of have to layer in other certifications as well. But one of the things I find about certifications is that they exclude a huge part of the industry, because you have to pay for certifications as well. So here we're back to what I mentioned in the early days of the webinar, is that you've got a whole bunch of brands in the middle who can't afford to pay for those. But we now, have consumers, have come to expect that you see certifications. And yeah, of course, we want some sort of, you know, third-party verified assurance that brands are saying things that they're doing. But actually, maybe you're excluding brands from who you would buy based on the fact that they don't have a certification when they actually can't afford it in the first place, and around we go. So certifications, while yes, definitely, like, they are needed in some respects to have that third-party validation to protect workers. Some are stronger than others. At the same time, they can be, I don't know, just exclude some brands that we should be looking to nearly as pioneers, because in the industry we like, well, this goes for all industries, there's kind of two types of brands really. There's those born good brands who are born with that real hardcore purpose, like Birdsong at their core. And then you get everybody else who are just the traditional ones trying to turn the ship slowly. And they're heavily reliant on, because that is a thing that demonstrates actions that they are taking to be able to change the industry around. So certifications are really, they're tricky, they're expensive, there's too many of them, they're a really tricky thing.
I think a lot of them are tied to who can afford teams to write policies in order to get the certification. I think one that we kind of trust is like OTEX certified. That's kind of one, but we will always probe into, you know, more than just the certificate. I think that only gives like a tiny part of the picture, as kind of Kellie said.
Thank you very much. Okay, the next question then is from Mary Molumby. So Mary, if you're there, if you want to ask the question yourself, please.
Hi, sorry, my name's actually Sai, but I'm using my mum's laptop.
Okay.
So,
Hi, Sai.
my question is, do you think a lot of brands are paying more lip service rather than action? And from my perspective, I think that sustainability has become more of a buzzword in society, just to attract consumers.
100%, yeah. It's even in the beginning, actually, like when we started, we could send out a press release about sustainability and it wouldn't get any traction. And then there was a kind of period, maybe 2016, 2017, when suddenly if we sent off a press release with our sustainable credentials, we'd automatically get amazing press. And now we're competing with every single other brand. It just becomes meaningless. Like, in terms of like the evidence we were presenting to the advertising standards and like the environmental committee as well, brands can hide keywords like sustainable and ethical in their metadata in their websites. So every time I search sustainable, ethical brands that are in no way ethical or sustainable will come up, because they've got those keywords kind of embedded deep within their site. And that was something I was trying to talk to MPs about. But if they're not from an e-commerce background, it can be quite hard to get their heads around. But massively, it's become a buzzword. I think in the same way that we've seen the commodification and co-option of all major political movements, from feminism and hashtag girl boss, and, you know, like anything that can be kind of become commercial. I think one of the things that breaks my heart is hoping that brands don't sell a vision of sustainability that's purely based in marketing in order to sell us a vision of a better future, which doesn't exist if they are carrying on the way that they do.
What's interesting for me on this one is lots of people think that I work in comms, where I help to structure sustainability frameworks across business operations and down to supply chains and put plans in place about the practical things that you do. And everyone's like, oh, you work in sustainability comms, it's so amazing. And that's no disrespect to anyone working in sustainability comms, which is great, but they are two entirely different things. Just one comment that I have in the language is, in sustainability, we love to over intellectualize everything, and it's the people in the room who know the most about all the different subjects. So we're talking about regeneration, and we're talking about circularity, we're talking about decarbonizing this, that and the other, and definitely all those things are super important, but we tend to sort of use language that can be really difficult to sort of, I don't know, unpick and just understand. And I definitely, as an industry professional who reads loads of reports, has been working in the industry for a long time, sometimes have to ask people to, can you just say that to me plainly? What are we talking about? Are we talking about, you know, making the soil better? Is that ultimately what we're doing? So I think the issue that we have is, when we use all those industry terms internally in sustainability conversations, we put them into marketing now. Like, who really knows what circular means? Like, Sophie, you were saying that retailer in Peckham has that circular in their window. Like, what does that mean? Half of the industry doesn't even really know what it means. You know, I mentioned earlier, circularity doesn't really exist. Everything that we do to be circular is extending the life of a product, which is great, but that's not circularity. Anyway, it all just gets thrown into consumer comms because people are desperate to be associated with those words. But I think the company that is able to crack that consumer piece, where you're educating and not overwhelming people, but getting the message across about what you're doing to be better, I just think they will change the industry really, because people are really confused. And that's why greenwashing has been so rife, because people just want to give companies the benefit of the doubt, and they don't have that deep knowledge, and they just see one or two things and go, oh, that's an indication that they're better, which is absolutely fair enough, because it's just human nature really.
That's great.
Thank you. And I think the next question kind of ties in what you were saying quite well. So Gosha, would you like to ask your question, please, about the brands?
Hi. Yeah, it's kind of, you already spoken a lot about that. In a way, we consumers are blamed for consuming and for creating this world a bad place. And I just wonder, could we just have an access to a list? Okay, these are the brands. No, never go there. Or these are the brands which are okay. Can I just, because I think it's so confusing. The legislation is not there. There is no transparency. There is greenwashing, and it's all left for us to figure out. So, as an example, in Primark now, what they have clothing which is branded as coming from recycled bottles. Yeah, so you would think brilliant, but we don't know. Is it 5% or is it 100%, and how much energy it took to actually make it, and who made it, and all of that. But people probably would like to make the right decisions, but we just don't know what. Now we have to question as well our need to shop and the whole consumerism, of course, but I think that's a much deeper question, why we're doing it and why Western world needs this, this thrill of shopping. But just, could we have an access? Go for this. If you have to shop, go there, don't go there.
So do you want to go, Sophie? I can.
So it's name really, and shame.
It's really tough. I mean, I basically say if they're on the high street, I don't trust them. Good On You's quite a good website to kind of get the lowdown on why brands aren't as good as they say they are. I'd say go for a smaller brand because they're going to be producing less volumes, and unless they're explicitly stating that they pay a living wage and have unions and measures in place to treat the workers well, unless that's really explicit, there's probably human slavery in the supply chain, unfortunately. Yeah, and they're probably overproducing, and they're probably using toxic chemicals in their processes.
100%, I don't think it should be on consumers to sort out any of this problem. You know, we touched on consumer culture, which is a whole other beast unto itself that's endemic across our whole Western society. So that's something else outside of the industry that needs to be addressed. But it's looking at how we can, I don't know, I think what consumers want is a simple message, and it's really not a simple thing. And I know you're asking us for a list there, and I could suggest what Sophie said, Good On You, or go to the Fashion Transparency Index from Fashion Revolution, but actually that only indicates transparency. It doesn't, it doesn't indicate sustainability. It actually is not simple. It's highly, highly complicated, but we of course want to invest our money in ways that is going to have a good impact. And we don't want to be giving our monies to a company that we feel don't reflect our values. But it does come back to those simple things of like, wear what you have in your wardrobe, care for it, repair it, and buy secondhand first. When you're buying something new, buy it from small independent brands, like Sophie said, indicate a living wage, have for the most part responsible materials, use recycled materials. It's nearly like a tiered decision-making tool for yourself. And I mean, the internet is full of kind of tips of things that you can do, but there's probably about 4 or 5. And then if you have to, which loads of people do, shop from high street brands, really dig into it and send those customer service emails, because I've been inside brands working in teams on sustainability where I get customer service emails going, can you answer this person about this? So they don't go unheard. They, you might just get the stock answer from a report, or you might get a really genuine answer with some impact metrics, which will be amazing. But I really encourage people to just send those emails, send those tweets, those DMs or whatever, because it does get through eventually, and companies go where the money is and you're investing your money. So you have the right to ask those questions.
100%. I would, in Aja's book, which Kelly mentioned, Consumed, which has come out recently, there's templates for writing to brands, to writing to your MP. And yeah, I absolutely, I would never want to, I always say to people, it's not the consumer's responsibility, it's absolutely the brand. And sometimes you do need, kids' school trousers, you need socks, you need pants, you've ripped your tights in your train station. Of course, you're going to buy something that's not ethically produced. I'm using a MacBook Air, it'd be hypocritical to say that we're immune to buying anything without suffering, because we live in a capitalist society, unfortunately. But pressuring brands, DMing them, asking the right questions, as Kelly said, is the best way to go about it, I think.
think the problem is though that this is, not everyone has the capacity to do it, and not everyone is in the position to do it. And actually, unless it's very transparent, it will be very slow change, and we need the change fast. So people who are, knowledgeable or know how to go about things, we can try to push, but we need to change the masses. And to change the masses, the information has to be there very clear. I just don't understand how is it possible in 21st century that in EU we have legislation, there is no child labor, but yet it is not illegal to bring goods which are made by children. It's just scandalous. So.
Just one other point to make about consumers and having to reach the mainstream, like absolutely yes, but the other thing to think about is that the fashion industry, like any industry, is made up of stakeholder groups. So while you have some consumers putting pressure on, you have pressure on legislation, you have retailers putting pressure on the brands, they stop to answer certain questions, you have academics putting pressure on. So I will say the reason we're even having this conversation now, and that I'm so busy in my work, thank you everyone, is because of all of those actions of all of those people over the last 10, 15, and particularly in the last 5 years, where there's been a bit more of a surge. It absolutely makes a difference. We don't have to wait until the whole entire mainstream of the fashion industry is over on this sustainability side, because while we're pushing on the consumer side, people like me are pushing inside brands, people like Sophie are pushing, offering a better product, and then government legislative pushes are happening as well. So it's kind of this spinning plates and they're all going like this, but it's moving. I mean, it's still slow, but it's moving faster than I've known it to move. So, yeah.
Thank you. I have lots of questions here to get through, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I'll pass on back to Alako now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Lucia. Yeah, so I was going to finish up by saying, for information about what we were talking tonight, to have a look at the Fashion Revolution website, and as they have templates for tweets and for emails that you can send to fashion brands, and the Good On You app that you guys mentioned for checking. Like, I use it all the time myself. I type in a brand and see how they're doing. Shop local, shop secondhand, and buy from sustainable brands where possible. Okay, so I'm sorry we lost Nasreen, but I'd like to thank our panel for what was an amazing panel discussion. And thank you to Kellie, Nasreen, and Sophie for sharing your expertise and your experiences from the industry. It was such a riveting and educational discussion. Thank you to all of our guests for joining us this evening and for the thought-provoking questions.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks so much everyone for attending.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It's not an easy one to get to at 6 o'clock after work and study, so really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks.
Thanks
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.